One of the things that you are going to be doing in the next few weeks is, or you're going to be learning about how to prune trees. And so I want to talk a little bit about how some of the information that I gave you can be applied to pruning. Now, before we get into that, I want you to remember, when you prune the tree, you are wounding the tree. And that means you are reducing its potential to do photosynthesis and make food. You're also opening pathways for pathogens, and you're forcing the tree to expend energy on wound closure. So as you can see, there are a lot of bad things that happen when you prune the tree. So you should have a really good reason to prune the tree. And some of the reasons people give for pruning trees, and this is kind of, to a certain extent, this is my take on the best to the worst, is maintaining the health of the tree. So sometimes you'll have a fungal infection in the tree, in some of the branches. For example, black knot in some of the, or a plant in the genus Prunus. And one way to maintain the health of the tree is to prune out those infected tissues. We might also prune to reduce the risk of failure. So you may have a branch that has included bark that you want to take care of, or codominant leaders, or in some cases, when the pruning has gotten away from you, you may have one great big branch that's reaching out and overbalancing the tree, or potentially overbalancing it. A lot of these failure risks can be taken care of when the tree is young by doing good structural pruning on it when it's still a fairly small tree, and you can do it standing on the ground with a pair of hand pruners or loppers. Another reason to prune is to provide clearance. This is so that people can walk by on sidewalks. There's room for vehicles to drive on the street, or you can park in your driveway. You might also need to prune for clearance. I just had to do this with a couple of my trees because the branches are reaching over the roof, and they are starting to actually hit the roof when the wind blows hard, and that can damage your shingles and things. Again, this is something that can be fixed by planting the right tree in the right place. So making sure you've got the right shape of the canopy for the tree you're planting, and it won't interfere with the sidewalks and driveways. If you are growing fruit, you sometimes do pruning to influence flower and fruit production. This is something that goes on a lot in the orchards. And we're not going to talk about that because as far as what's in your book, I think you would find that the way you prune apple trees is completely the opposite of what they say to do in the book. People will also prune to reduce shade. And my take on that is, if you've got a problem growing plants in the shade, grow other plants that can take the shade rather than pruning the tree. We also sometimes will prune for wind resistance. This is being thrown into question now by some new science, where we're looking at how the tree interacts with the wind. It used to be, we thought of it kind of as a sail, but now we realize it's thousands or tens of thousands of sails in terms of all of the leaves and the branches and twigs and everything. And the way the wind interacts with those can create a process called mass dampening. So if we prune improperly, we can actually increase wind resistance rather than lower it. And then a couple of other reasons people prune trees to improve their view or improve their aesthetics. In my feeling is the Washington football team will never go back to the Super Bowl until Dan Snyder replants all those trees he cut down to improve his view. So we talked about how trees grow. We talked about the hormones. We talked about the coded response. All of these things come into play when we start thinking about how to prune trees. The first thing to realize is that trees grow in the forest where their lower branches get shaded and they can die. So they had to evolve a mechanism to deal with losing those branches, those lower branches, due to that forest shading. And the way they do this is there is a thing at the base of the branch. It's called the branch collar. And inside the trunk, which is what you can see on the outside, on the inside, there is the branch protection zone. And in this area, which frequently is quite visible because of the swelling at the base of the branch, the meristem there is primed to create that callus tissue and grow that wound wood to rapidly seal that wound. The tree has also stored a lot of chemicals to defend the tree. So it's really important when you prune the branches to protect that branch collar and not cut it off. That means you don't want to make a flush cut, because then you're cutting off all of this stuff the tree evolved in order to deal with that wound. You also want to make sure your cuts are helping support the coated response. So it's helping the tree grow that new wood, that fourth wall that's going to seal off that wound. And that means, in particular, you don't put in most of these things, these products that are sold as wound sealant. So the way to tell if you should or should not use this product is, some of them say, yeah, you can seal your wounds, but you can also seal your gutters and various other things. You don't want to put that on your wound. We talked about suppressing those terminal buds. So you want to make your cuts so those terminal buds stay, or the terminal buds suppressing the lateral buds rather. So you want to make those cuts so those those lateral buds can continue to be suppressed, and you don't get this sudden shock of sprouts below the cut, which is what you see when people top their trees. That hormone system is also creating a hierarchy of buds, so that in addition to suppressing lateral buds, the rank of the terminal bud on a branch is also affecting the rate of growth of that branch. And if you demote that bud, you can control the branch growth. And all pruning should be done at branch unions, except for some very specialized pruning systems that they may still be talking about, pollarding and coppicing. These are medieval pruning systems that were designed to grow sprouts, because that's all the medieval peasants could get. The trees belong to the Lord. The sprouts belong to the medieval peasants, and they used it for making brooms, for building walls. If you've ever heard of Wattle and Dept, what they would do is weave these small branches together and then plaster them over with mud or some other substance like that. Nobody in the US ever does this, because when we got here, there were trees everywhere and we no longer had to use that kind of building method. But they keep talking about it. If you go out into the woods and you pay attention, you may see something like this. This is a branch that died, and you can see the branch collar down here. And what the tree is trying to do is it's trying to pinch off this dead branch, but there is stuff in here that protects the tree and keeps decay from traveling down that branch into the part that's in the middle of the tree. This is also why you want to prune dead wood off of your tree, is to get it out of the way. Remember, I said we want to help that coated process. So getting this branch out of the way would help this tree close that wound. And what's going to eventually happen with that wound is it's going to look like this. Somebody on the walk on Saturday mentioned the eyes on the tree. So you can see the structure here. It looks like an eye. Well, that is where there was a branch growing out of the side of this tree. And that's that branch bark ridge. And the poplar That branch got shaded off. The poplar has already successfully pinched it off. And over time, as the trunk of the tree expands, this will disappear because you get complete bark growing over the eye there, and this branch bark ridge will eventually get pushed far enough out that it will just slough off. So that's part of what the tree is doing naturally. When we prune trees, if you go to page 65 of your manual, you will see this picture. This is called the 3-cut method. If you remember, when I talked about reaction wood, I talked about how gravity is pulling down on the branch, which stresses or stretches the wood on the top of the branch and puts it in tension, but it also squeezes the wood on the bottom of the branch, putting it into compression. And between those two zones, the tension zone and the compression zone, there is what's called a shear plane. That's where the wood goes from being in tension to being in compression. And this is a fragile part of the branch. This is where, if you get a longitudinal crack in the branch, it happens along that shear plane. So when we're dealing with a larger branch and using a saw, you would normally use this 3-cut method. And this first cut here goes about halfway through the branch, and you need to cut all the way into that shear plane. It doesn't hurt to cut on the bottom because the tree just pinches together and those two parts of the cut will close together to prevent that shear plane crack. But when you cut on the top and you make that second cut further away from the trunk than the first cut, you're going to cut all the way through and you're going to go through that shear plane. And I've seen, and this has happened to me on occasion, you'll get a crack and it cracks down to that first cut, and that cut stops the tearing of the branch. And that's why you have that first cut there, and then you make the second cut that takes the weight off the limb, is so that if it does crack, it won't tear all the way down into the branch collar and down into the trunk to make a large wound on the tree. And then your final cut, the third cut, is where you remove that little stub that you made. Now, you don't have to do this on all of your cuts. If you're using hand pruners or loppers, you can make just the one cut at the final cut. If it's a relatively small branch, it's a little too big for your loppers, but it may not be so long, and you can control the weight with your offhand. You can make the cut through there, although I do recommend, if you're using a saw, you do this 3-cut method. And here is that piece I showed you on Saturday. This is what it looked like when it was up in the tree. You can still see the branches still attached to it, but this is that crack that occurred along the shear plane from the loading. And essentially what happened here is there was so much weight on the end of the tree, the compressive forces on the bottom of the branch pushed that compression wood away from the tension wood. And this is what can happen if you don't use the 3-cut method. Now, to be fair to my neighbor, this is a picture I took in my neighborhood after the storm. It may be that he had a shear plane crack, a complete failure on this branch that caused this damage. But this is what can happen if you don't use that 3-cut method when you are cutting a larger branch, is you can rip part of the branch off into the trunk of the tree. And as you can see, this is going to be a large wound for the tree to seal over compared to if it just had the wound surface here. As I mentioned, you make all of your cuts at a branch union. And there are only 2 types of cuts. There is the removal cut, which is where you are removing the smaller piece at that branch union. So here we have a branch. This could be the trunk of the tree. It could be a branch and a lateral. And we make the cut here and we protect the branch bark ridge. Or we protect the branch collar with the branch bark ridge here. And you can see in the diagram here, this is called a removal cut because we're removing branches from the tree. The other type of cut you make is a reduction cut. And if you go to page 63, there are more details, and I'm sure you'll learn how to make these cuts. One thing to notice is it's not straight across the branch. There is a downward angle here. And so here you are taking the bigger part at the branch union. This is sometimes called reducing to a lateral. And by making the cut right here at the branch union and with that downward angle, what's happening is you are turning the terminal bud in this branch from the one that maybe was up here to this one. But this bud then is taking over the job of suppressing the lateral buds along the branch here. It also makes a good clean cut that the tree is in pretty good shape to seal over. So here is an example. I made a reduction cut on my red maple. The branch that was attached here was growing down into and causing some clearance problems on my driveway. I made the cut in 2008. This is what it looked like in 2009. Notice there are no sprouts along the branch here. Still no sprouts here in 2011. You can see the wound wood that's forming to close over it. This is what it looked like back in January when I was taking pictures of this tree after the snowstorm. In the manual, they talk about the 1/3 ratio, and this applies both to reduction cuts and removal cuts. And they present it as sort of a rule that you should never violate this. So the 1/3 ratio is the ratio of the two parts of the branch union. So at the branch union, you will have two pieces, and the ratio would be the smaller diameter over the larger diameter. And the reason I call it a watchout situation means that you should be careful if you are violating this 1/3 rule. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but you might want to think it through again and consider other alternatives. So with removals, you want to try to avoid removing branches that are more than 1/3 the diameter of the larger part. So if you're cutting a branch off the trunk, you would prefer if you do it when that branch is less than 1/3 the diameter of the trunk. If you're cutting a lateral branch off, you want it to be less than 1/3 the diameter of the branch. I know in the book it says when you do the removal cuts, you should be reducing to a lateral that is more than 1/3 the diameter of the removed part. Again, that is a demarcation point. That is a suggestion. You can reduce, and in fact, when you're pruning shrubs frequently, I just did a reduction or rejuvenation pruning on one of my shrubs where I was reducing the branches to a lateral bud, not a lateral branch. It's just, that is a cautionary situation. You want to pay attention to it. You might want to think about another way of approaching the problem if you're going to violate that 1/3 rule. We mentioned hormones, and I talked about this a little bit about how the terminal bud is producing the most auxin, and it's controlling or suppressing buds, and it is also helping control the rate of diameter growth. When you do that reduction cut, you're replacing the terminal bud on the branch to a lower ranked branch, a lower ranked bud that's going to produce less auxin, and that can slow down the growth rate of the branch relative to other parts of the tree. So let me give you a couple of examples. I taught my first pruning class back in 2008, and I had this nice little crabapple tree that I had planted about 3 or 4 years earlier. And I went out and looked at it and noticed that there were some problems with this tree. In particular, it had a codominant leader. It also had a vigorous lower branch here. So here's the codominant leader where it joins with the other leader. Here is that vigorously growing branch. Notice the size of this branch relative to the trunk of the tree. This is well in excess of 1/3 the diameter. It's almost the same. So that ratio is almost 1. Up here, we're still looking at a branch that is pretty close to that 1/3 ratio that we want to avoid. The other thing is this was a young tree. I didn't want to give up too much photosynthetic area, too much leaf surface. And it's possible if I could control this branch, I could turn it into a structural branch because it was growing more or less straight up. This one I knew I was going to have to take off because it's growing straight out towards the tree or towards the street. So it was eventually going to have to come up. So how did I deal with these? Well, let's look at that codominant leader first. Instead of removing it, which I could have done, I went and I found a good lateral branch and I did a reduction cut. And notice I put my pruners, I was holding them in kind of an overhand grip and they were going straight across the branch. But before I made the cut, I rotated my hand down to more of a handshake position and I made that cut. And what I was doing here is I had this straight line here. I could visualize the branch bark ridge, even though it was very faint because this is a small tree. And I bisected that angle. And this is the final cut that I made. So what happened as a result of this over the next several years? Well, this is what it looked like in 2008, almost the same diameter. You can see that just 3 years later, the trunk of the tree was much bigger than that codominant leader, that potential codominant leader. And by 2016, significant difference in the diameters. And so I have left this branch on as a scaffold branch for the canopy. But it's no longer threatening to be a codominant leader because I made that reduction cut and I slowed down its rate of growth relative to the other leader. In terms of what happened with that cut, this is what it looked like in October of 2008. By March of 2011, it had completely healed over, and there's no 2016 picture because I can't find the wound anymore. I don't know where I made that cut exactly. But also notice there is a definite kink here, and it's going away as this tree grows. So those forces on the cambium are also straightening this up and getting rid of that kink. I did the same thing with that vigorous low-growing branch. I found a convenient leader or lateral branch, and I made a reduction cut here. If I was doing this today, I might just prune this branch off and make the reduction cut to this lateral to get this to have more of an upright structure. But I did that. There's the cut I made. And you can see I am not cutting straight across the piece I'm cutting off. I'm cutting at an angle. And again, this is what it looked like in 2008. The ratio was close to 1. By 2011, the trunk of the tree was significantly bigger than that branch, well below that 1/3 ratio. And I'm pretty sure right after I took this picture, I cut that branch off. But I could do it now without having to worry about making a relatively large wound on the trunk of the tree. One last thing I want to talk about, and then we can take questions until late in the evening, is root pruning. You're probably as tree stewards only going to be involved with root pruning when you are planting trees, and I'll explain what that means. But one of the things to keep in mind is roots do not get shaded in the forest and die. So the trees really have not evolved a good system for losing roots like they have with branches. When you are doing root pruning, keep that dendritic pattern of growth in mind. So larger roots connect to a larger part of the root system. If you're cutting a 2-inch diameter root, you're probably going to be removing a lot more roots from the tree than if you're cutting a 1-inch diameter root. In terms of, and this will become important on the next slide, remember those absorbing roots are being shed and regrown constantly. So you don't have to worry too much about cutting those small roots. The same thing applies. There is a rule of thumb that you can apply to root pruning. And that rule is that if the root is less than the diameter of your thumb, about 1 inch, it's going to sprout new roots and grow rapidly. So you don't really need to worry too much about cutting roots that are less than 1 inch in diameter. And keep in mind that if you are cutting a root that's still in the soil and you're pulling your saw through that soil, it will dull your saw pretty rapidly. So it would be a good idea to have a root pruning saw and a crown pruning saw, because you want to use good sharp tools if you can. In my case, I've got a bow saw that I use for root pruning, and I have a root pruning root pruning blade and a canopy pruning blade. So where might you apply this? Well, this is a Clethra ulnifolia variety hummingbird that my wife and I purchased to replace a large Asian azalea near our front door. And I was planning to bare root this when I got it home, so I didn't pull it out and look at it. But once we pulled it out of the container, I realized that it was so root bound, getting rid of the that growth medium around the root ball was not an option. And as I looked at it, I saw all these small roots that were obviously growing right at the diameter, and some of them were circling. They were not too much of a concern, but these roots here that were growing down and back into the root ball, and there's another one over here, there were a number of larger roots that were growing in the wrong direction, and they will never correct themselves when you put them in the ground. So there's been a lot of research that's been done to figure out, well, what do we do with a root ball that looks like this? And the answer is you prune it. So I took my old bow saw with my old blade on it, and I cut about 1.5 inches, 1 inch to 1.5 inches off of the edge of the root ball all the way around. So I turned it from this into this, and then I planted it. And then that summer I had a fight with my wife, who said that because I did this, the tree was not getting enough water and we had to constantly water it. That was not correct. I explained to her that because this was so root bound and there are so many absorbing roots in here, that they were drying out this root ball very quickly, which is why we had to water it 2 or 3 times a week. Fortunately, it was right by the front door, and we'd look at it in the morning and say, oh, the leaves would start to wilt, would be wilting, and we knew it was time to water it again. So that's what I have for you. This is my contact information. And now I will entertain any questions that you have. I don't know anything about YouTube channels. So let's see. I need some tree jokes. My best tree joke is a tree never hits a car except in self-defense.
That's a good one. Huh. Well, folks, there's 47 of you on. No questions for this. All right.
For Merrill, the best way to find an arborist is go to goodtreecares.com. You tree stewards should be memorizing that because you really shouldn't be recommending a specific arborist.
Right. And all of the tree stewards, if you look in your packet, you've got a mature tree care. It's a poster that tree stewards developed under a grant, and it talks about using certified arborists and how to reach them. So there's information in there, as well as a great diagram that I love. Not a diagram, a photo of of this dog. And it says, you wouldn't let just anyone operate on your dog. Why would you let them on your tree?
Very good point. Trees are very complicated living things, and they need to be cared for by professionals.
Right. And it's, is that the trees are good spot or the? No.
Good tree
What's the
care
name?
is
Good Tree Care. That's the
good
Mid-Atlantic.
tree care is the Mid-Atlantic one, and then there are trees. What is it? Trees Are Good is the ISA website that has a
That's
lot
the
of
national.
information on it. International. That's what the I stands for in ISA.
Oh, right.
Hello, can I speak?
Yes, Catherine.
This
Yes.
isn't a tree joke, but it's a story. I've been seeing a couple of stories about online about a multi-billionaire person who lives somewhere in the Adriatic region who is transplanting mature trees to make a park. Has anyone else read about him? There have been photographs online of these barges transporting these huge trees along the coast, which have got a kind of surreal quality. But he's made this big public park with all these trees that he's brought from all over Eastern Europe, I guess. And it's free park. And there's, of course, it's prompted a lot of dialogue about what kind of an idea is this. I just wondered if anybody else had read about that. It's kind of interesting story
No.
about the proper propriety and reasonableness of doing this.
Right. Okay. Well, we will hear Jim again in whenever he talks to us about tree problems on
March 8th.
March 8th. Right. And then a tree walk after that. So that's great. Catherine, did you have any other class activities you wanted to bring out?
I don't think so, unless, but if you have some, please go ahead.
There's a couple more questions in the chat.
Oh, there are. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So
Tell
Jim,
us.
if you would, okay, I can read them. Hold on. So one of them is
Trees are digitally savvy. They know how to log in.
That's good.
well, that is there a better time of the year for pruning?
We go around and around on this. You know, the general recommendation is that you prune during the dormant season, and that can come out. You know, that can. The reason for doing it is, remember, the response to the tree requires active growth. So if you do it during the dormant season, that will give the tree a longer period of time during the year to the first year to respond to it. But you can pretty much prune any tree at any time. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that. One is that when you prune the tree, you can attract insects. And in some cases, for example, Dutch elm disease is carried by elm bark beetles, and they are attracted to newly pruned trees, and they fly in late summer. So you don't want to be pruning the tree and attracting those beetles when they're out, when the adults are out flying around and maybe carrying Dutch elm disease And there are some others like that. For commercial arborists, there are some trees that are called bleeders, maples and birches and pines in particular tend to be pushing a lot of sap early in, at the end of the dormant period and in the growing season. So professional arborists tend to avoid pruning them, not because it's bad for the tree, but because the client will look out and they'll see all this sap coming out of the wound and they'll get all freaked out and start complaining and making life miserable. So that's just a good client relationship there. But in general, you can prune a tree anytime unless you're doing a really big pruning, and those should be done during the dormant season in the winter when the tree is not growing as much, especially above ground.
Okay, another question is, could you explain the angle of your cut on the crabapple?
Yes, I can. Would you like me to?
Somebody,
Yes.
yeah,
So-
this was from Robert.
So, and this is probably in your book. What I said was when you're doing that, and this is true also now, or for removal cuts, when you are making your cut, you want to start at the branch bark ridge and go across the piece that you are going to cut off, whether it's a reduction cut or a removal cut. And then, and you can even, take a marker and you can mark that line. And then when you make your cut, you want to bisect the angle between that perpendicular line and the branch bark ridge. So that is the standard Shigo method of pruning trees. In Germany, they've done some more research, and what they found was that when you do removal cuts like that, you can actually leave a piece of the stub in that outside that branch protection zone. And so instead of doing that angle bisection that's in your book, you just cut straight down from the outside edge of the branch bark ridge. But that's why, remember I said that branch bark ridge is really important when you're pruning, because that's how you determine where to make those cuts.
Okay, there are a couple more questions, but before I get into them, could you say what the arborist website is, and I'll put it in the chat. Just tell
Oh,
me.
I put it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
trees
Sorry,
are-
I didn't see that.
Goodtreecare.com to find an arborist. Trees are good to get information on tree care. You can also find an arborist from Trees Are Good because the ISA is also maintaining a database and you can search that geographically.
Okay.
Jim, isn't it goodtreecare.org? Or is it .com?
I'm pretty sure it's .com.
Hmm.
That's just an LOO.
All right. If you bind up arborvitae branches weighed down by heavy snow and restore shape, do you need to remove ropes later so tree can gain strength muscles? As
Yes,
it
absolutely. Remember I told you about the effects of variable loads on the cambium and how that develops the the taper of the tree. So that's really important that you not prevent the tree from moving, because that's how it gains strength. So if you bound up those branches, and actually your arborvitae, you shouldn't need to bind them up. If you're just patient, those loads on the cambium will cause the tree to lift those branches back up. But it may take a growing season or two if they've suffered through it. But you definitely need to unbind those trees and let them move so that they can develop that strength.
Okay, could you talk about bark cracking from scalding and what to do if needed?
So bark can crack from scalding. It can also crack from frost. And what that is, it's usually on the southwest side of the tree. And when we have cold weather like we have had recently, in the afternoon, as the sun warms up that tissue, it can cause this variable freeze thaw reaction that can cause the wood fibers underneath the bark to split. And except hope that the tree recovers. I was down in Red Rocks National Forest, which is on the way to Bryce Canyon, Utah. And at the top of the ridge, we got into this campground and it had a whole bunch of aspens that had these ridges in them where they had frost cracks that were healing up. The same thing can happen from sun scald. But there's really nothing you can do about that except make the tree as happy as possible and take as few, let it devote as many resources as it can to dealing with that problem. And we'll talk more about that on March 8th when we talk about disease.
Okay, I think we've hit 9 o'clock and we promised to let people go
Yep.
then. So I'm going to stop the recording and thank you so much, Jerry.